Yeah.
Have you seen it at all?
I haven't actually.
Well, I'm the villain in the documentary, so that's. I was a Calumet County District Attorney from 1992 until 2010. That included the time frame of the Avery investigation and prosecution, and I was appointed as the Special Prosecutor by the Manitowoc County District Attorney, who Manitowoc County is an adjacent county to Calumet County. Not only was I appointed, but our Sheriff's Department was asked to and accepted responsibility as the lead investigative agency. Well, I don't know if I ever used, well, maybe I did use the term propaganda, but it's what's called an advocacy piece. It was intended to be something that supported a particular defense theory. It was made by and for the Avery defense team, and it really only suggests one theory about what happened and picks and chooses, cherry picks, if you will, evidence from this 18-month process to support that particular conclusion. That is that Steven Avery was improperly convicted. There was a miscarriage of justice, and they even go as far to say evidence was planted and that Steven was the product of or the victim of some vast conspiracy. Well, it absolutely is. It's not a documentary at all. It's a advocacy piece, and when you realize that these filmmakers created this project as such. In fact, there's a finished product out there, a movie, a short film that was presented to the Columbia Film Festival that shows exactly what it is. Sometime before February of 2013, I became aware of this finished product. I asked the filmmakers to view that finished product, the same thing thousands of people had seen, so that I could see what their allegations were before I did an interview that I had agreed to do with the filmmakers. They refused to show that to me, despite the defense having not only seen it but participated in its creation. I felt that was unfair, that it looked like exactly what it was, that I was being set up, and even though being asked for a sound bite in this case, I really wasn't given any opportunity to participate in its creation like the defense team was. Well, it's absolute nonsense. All you have to do is look at what it is that the state proved to the jury, presented by way of evidence that dispelled this planting evidence nonsense. The jury got to see all of the evidence, the things that the documentarians refused to show the public, things like Teresa Halbach's phone and PDA and her camera being found on Avery's property in his burn barrel, apart from where her bones and things were burned. Why don't you provide that evidence? Why isn't that important enough? Well, the answer, of course, is that it's inconsistent with their narrative. It's inconsistent with the suggestion that this was all planted evidence. Why don't you include that Avery's DNA, non-blood DNA, is found on the hood latch of the victim's car when his sweaty hands reach up underneath the hood, and he leaves his DNA on the hood latch, and the crime lab later finds that. Why don't you include that? The answer is obvious, that it does not coincide with, it's in fact absolutely inconsistent with any planting defense that they suggested, and as long as they can keep that from the public who watches this, as long as they can suggest, in some conclusory fashion, well, we did the best we could by presenting the other side of the story, when you include those centerpieces of the state's case that absolutely dispelled that planting defense, it becomes crystal clear what their agenda was. Yeah, I'm actually, since I'm a defense attorney now in private practice, I'm actually very happy with the response, at least insofar as it brings up some legitimate questions about our legal system, especially the criminal justice process. There's some real concerns that are raised by this piece, and frankly, if they would have included both sides of it, this documentary would still have been just as entertaining. In fact, it probably would have been much better received even than it is, because this is such a compelling story. It's a tragic story of this man who was wrongfully convicted and later involves himself and encourages his 16-year-old nephew to be involved in this. So the story itself is compelling. The problem, of course, is now we're left with only one side of the story having been told. It obviously cries out for the other side to, in some public forum, be explained what the public didn't get to see. No, what I'm saying, in fact, is that if I was spoon-fed only what the Netflix documentary wanted me to see, I'd come to exactly the same conclusion. I can absolutely see why everybody's so upset and believes that a miscarriage happened. Quite frankly, if I had 10 years to pick and choose bits and pieces of evidence and to edit clips so that it looked like a certain way to only support one conclusion, they better reach that conclusion or they haven't done their job. I'm not upset at all with the general public who has expressed such angst over this case itself. What I am upset about is Netflix and these filmmakers when they purposely withhold the other side of the case, when they then suggest that this is a documentary that you've basically seen everything that there was to see. I think it is unconscionable to make that suggestion. It's irresponsible, actually, to suggest that this is a documentary. When they go further, though, and they name two police officers as having planted evidence, and when they identify the lead prosecutor in the case as, in their words, being responsible for what happened here, is absolutely unfair. I take great offense to that, and I'm happy that I'm provided now the opportunity, even though it's not my job, I'm not a DA anymore, but I'm happy to have been provided the opportunity to present just a thumbnail of what it was that the audience didn't get to see, but what the jury did. I don't know that is something that I can actually comment on. You know, another agency also asked me about, am I going to be writing a book or putting something out on the other side of this? And I'm also unwilling to talk about anything publicly or formally that I intend to do to combat only one side of this having come out. So I'm sorry I can't talk about either one of those things. Well, I am. I'm a lawyer. I'm a private practice lawyer, and unlike some of the other people who have been attacked in this documentary, who have chosen to pretty much remain silent, that isn't necessarily my style. And so if I'm called out on a particular case, absolutely fine. Go ahead and call me out. But as you know, my having received threatening messages, my family having been threatened, their lives having been threatened, some really vile suggestions having been made by over 2,000 messages that I have received, goes well beyond any constructive dialogue that could have come from this really entertaining piece that was presented. Personally, for me, when that happens, I'm pretty sure I'm going to fight back. Many of the responses are opinions about my character. As you know, in 2010, 3 years after this prosecution was concluded, I involved myself in some really deplorable behavior, texting a crime victim, and it was a product of or fueled by a prescription drug dependence. I really enjoy this part of my life and even talking about it, because even though I had lost virtually everything as a result, my license was suspended. I had all of these challenges that came about because of it. It really provided me an opportunity to change who I was. Now I get to help people with addictions every day. I'm a defense attorney. Most of my clients have addictions or addiction issues. I tell them all about my story, about my journey, about the challenges that I've had, and I've really used it as best I can as a positive. But when these filmmakers try to shame me because of it, or try to define me as a person that was still in that dependence, or in that state of really poor decision making, or worse than that, when they suggest that the same decision making or the same behaviors were present 3 years earlier when the prosecution of Steven Avery was going on, it's absolutely untrue. They know it. Everybody who knows me knows that, and it's really unfair to paint me as such. You know, the filmmakers, when they were asked, well, why did you include that stuff about Mr. Kratz when it appears to have absolutely no relevance at all to this case? They said, well, it's up to the viewers to conclude if it's relevant or not. That's nonsense. It's absolute garbage. I'm really proud of my recovery journey. I intend to continue to help people. I intend not to be defined by that time in my life, but to open this up as a reason in present day, that is 10 years later, to try to affect my personal life, my family, their health, their safety, or my small little law firm here in Superior, I think is absolutely improper. I have. I'd prefer not to. I will say that we have included the participation now of law enforcement authorities, and so with some of the messages, and even going beyond that, some of the more specific threats as to either safety or our law firm, unfortunately, we had to include some authorities to just ensure our safety to the best that we can, and hopefully that is just idle rantings of individuals that are so affected by this documentary. I'm hoping that most of the general public will look at me now. We'll look at how many changes I've made since then. The documentary is particularly unflattering about me, about what appears to be and what was a very boastful, very egocentric individual, certainly with a little more confidence than perhaps he should have been exhibiting. The case kind of called for that kind of an approach for the lead prosecutor, but nonetheless, the piece seems to highlight some of my more unattractive moments. They don't ever broadcast me ensuring that the media understands that Mr. Avery is presumed innocent, that he enjoys the presumption of innocence, which I said every time. The fact that I almost never spoke to the media while this case was pending. It was only during the trial, after the trial, and during the investigative part of the cases that any comments were made. So it doesn't, I believe, give a fair representation of my behavior then. That having been said, I have made lots of changes since that time. I am, like I've said, very proud of the changes that I made. I'm not that person anymore, and we'll have to just leave it with that. Well, the other part of the documentary is a suggestion that I've presented inconsistent theories. That is, that she was either killed in the trailer or killed in the garage, and both trials, both the Avery and the Dassey trials and the closing arguments established just the opposite. Teresa Halbach was not killed in the trailer. She was killed in the garage. She was shot. The cause of death and the manner of death was homicidal violence through gunshot, and that's how she died. The fact that Brendan Dassey claims to have, in his words, cut her throat, when you watch the entire 3.5-hour confession and some of the subsequent statements that he makes, you'll understand that that was little more than a scratch that occurred. We didn't expect to find lots of blood or DNA evidence in the trailer. But because you don't get to hear that, because you don't get to hear the entire 3.5 hours of the confession, the details that are given by young Mr. Dassey, you would conclude, as I suppose I would have if I would have watched that, that there should be all kinds of blood and DNA in the trailer. That's not true at all. She was killed in the garage. Brendan Dassey, in his statement, says that they then took Teresa's body, her lifeless body, threw it in the back of her own SUV, and that's where her blood gets into or deposits in the back of the SUV. You heard some testimony about some pattern evidence and her hair and blood and the like, but a suggestion by the documentarians or the defense team that, well, this is unanswered and why would her own blood be there is nonsense. Everybody knows how it got there. Steven Avery and Brendan Dassey threw Teresa Halbach in the back of her own vehicle when they were deciding how to dispose of her body. Originally, Brendan Dassey indicates that they were going to dump her in the pond, but there wasn't enough water there, so it wasn't until a couple hours later that Steven decides that they're going to mutilate and dispose of her body by burning it. So this isn't some unanswered question or some loose ends. That was always the theory in both prosecutions, and it was supported by all the physical evidence. Absolutely. Steven Avery is right where he needs to be. That's in prison for the rest of his natural life. Steven Avery is a very violent, very sadistic individual. The evidence, his whole past, that much of which you didn't get to hear in the case, soaking his cat in gas and oil and throwing it on a fire, telling his inmate buddies in prison that he intended to rape and abduct and torture and kill young women, that he even drew a torture chamber as to how he planned to do it. These are the statements and behaviors of a man who took the life of a 25-year-old, very lovely young woman, innocent, targeted by Steven Avery. The evidence absolutely supported his conviction, and as I've mentioned before, the man's right where he needs to be. Brendan Dassey is one of the real tragedies of this case, not so much because of what he did or his involvement, but because it was so clear to us that without Steven Avery's involvement, Brendan Dassey never would have raped Teresa Halbach. Brendan Dassey never would have killed Teresa or participated in mutilating her body. Brendan Dassey was encouraged all throughout this case by Steven Avery, including sealing his fate when he handed Brendan the knife, saying to Brendan to go ahead and cut her throat. Brendan Dassey's silence was purchased by Steven Avery by including him in these crimes. And again, this 16-year-old kid who was learning disabled, or certainly had challenges, and from all other accounts seemed to be a pretty mild-mannered kid, unfortunately now, at least for the foreseeable future, will also be in the Wisconsin prison system. Well, I agree with Mr. Strang and Mr. Buting and the other defense attorneys when they concluded that this documentary itself will not have any legal impact on any of the case. Of course, absent a either a gubernatorial or a presidential pardon, it won't have any legal effect. What could happen, though, and the way to, or the path to a new trial, is the production or a discovery of new evidence, or if science progresses so that some things that were presented are called into question, or if there's other evidence that can be tested, or things like that, which is, I guess, ironically how Mr. Avery got out from his 1985 conviction. If any of that happens, Mr. Avery is entitled to, and he will receive, a new trial. Absent that, however, the fact that some movie suggests that he's been wrongfully convicted, or that despite what the jury concluded, we should all believe that poor Steven Avery was targeted or wrongfully convicted, isn't going to, at least in my opinion, lead to any kind of a legal result that will secure Mr. Avery's freedom. That's right. There's nothing new about this. As well done as it is in chronicling the defense side, and certainly the emotions from the Avery family and all of the defense team, it does very little to help the search for the truth. That's a function that is uniquely given to jurors, and the jurors did that when they returned their verdicts. No, again, I think it is a relatively positive thing that so many people are talking about some of the failings of the justice system. How it applies, however, to Steven Avery is something that is disappointing. My goal throughout this whole my goal throughout this whole project and process clearly was to hold accountable those individuals who were responsible for the death of this 25-year-old woman, and to provide some kind of closure for the victim's family. We did that with the trials, and the really unfortunate part of this case is that the victim's family, some of which have even been suggested in the internet as having murdered their family member, have had to listen to all of this nonsense, and have had to field questions or have even the prospect brought up to them that the real murderer of their family member is still out there. That isn't what the evidence showed. I believe that to be nonsense, and I hope as all of the evidence someday is shared with the general public, that everybody will come to that same conclusion. I have not. Because I'm not a DA anymore, because I don't represent the state, I don't represent the victims, I don't represent law enforcement, I really wouldn't have any opportunity, nor would I impose upon them to talk to them about this, what must be very sensitive topic for them. They deserve to be left alone, and that's what I've done.